The combine is on fire. Not metaphorically, not almost. The John Deere 4020 belonging to Gerald Whitmore, the most powerful man in Calhoun County, Kansas, is belching black smoke into a cloudless October sky, its hydraulic lines ruptured, its header chewing itself to pieces in the middle of a field that was supposed to be the crown jewel of the 1974 harvest. And the man standing at the fence line, watching it happen with quiet, steady eyes and his arms folded across a faded denim jacket. He's not laughing. He's not saying a word. He's just watching, the way a man watches something he already knew was coming. His name is Earl Dunbar. He farms 280 acres on the western edge of this county, drives a truck older than some of the men watching him, and hasn't touched a moldboard plow in 11 years. And before this October is over, every single person in Calhoun County is going to understand why. Let me tell you about Calhoun County, Kansas in the autumn of 1974. If you've never stood in the middle of the Kansas prairie in October, I want you to close your eyes for a moment and try to feel it. The sky is enormous, not just big but endless, the kind of blue that makes you feel small and grateful at the same time. The wind comes out of the northwest in slow, rolling waves, and it smells like dry grass and turned earth and something ancient underneath, something that was here long before any of us and will be here long after. The county seat was Millerton, population 4,200, give or take. It had a grain elevator that you could see from 6 miles out, a John Deere dealership on Route 56 that had expanded twice in the last decade, and a diner called Hazel's where farmers gathered every morning over coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in and argued about commodity prices and rainfall and who was expanding and who was being squeezed. This was the era of get big or get out. Agriculture economists were saying it on the radio. The USDA was printing it in pamphlets. Earl Butz, Nixon's Secretary of Agriculture, had been telling American farmers for 2 solid years to plant fence row to fence row, to borrow against the land, to buy bigger equipment, to produce. Corn was hitting $3.02 a bushel, its highest price in a generation. Wheat had surged. The world was hungry, they said. American farmers were feeding it. And in Calhoun County, nobody had embraced that gospel harder than Gerald Whitmore. But before we get to Gerald, let me tell you about the man at the fence line. Earl Dunbar was 58 years old in 1974, though most people who didn't know him guessed older. The Kansas sun and 35 years of outdoor labor had written their ledger on his face, deep lines around his eyes, the back of his neck the color of old saddle leather, hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same hardwood as a fence post. He'd inherited 280 acres from his father, Clarence Dunbar, in 1956, the same year Eisenhower was re-elected and the same year a drought came through western Kansas and cracked the topsoil into patterns that looked like old pottery shards. Clarence had farmed conventionally his whole life. Moldboard, plow, disc, harrow, every fall turn the earth, every spring start over. The Dunbar land had fed the family, but by the time Earl took it over, he could see, if he looked hard enough, that something was wrong. The topsoil was thinner than his father remembered it being. The creek that ran along the south fence was running muddy longer after every rainstorm, and in dry years, the wind would pick up a fine, reddish-brown haze from the eastern fields and carry it toward Millerton like a slow ghost. Earl had only a high school diploma and 1 year at the agricultural extension program in Manhattan, Kansas, before his father got sick and he came home. But he was a reader. His neighbors would have been surprised to know the titles on his shelf: Faulkner, yes, but also Edward Faulkner's Plowman's Folly, published in 1943, which argued with startling conviction that the moldboard plow was destroying American soil. He'd read it twice. He'd read William Albrecht's papers on soil fertility. He'd driven 4 hours to Wichita in 1963 to hear a soil scientist from Purdue give a lecture that only 11 farmers attended. By 1963, Earl Dunbar had made a decision that his neighbors thought was either brave or crazy, and most of them settled on crazy. He parked his plow for good. What he replaced it with was a story that would take 11 years and one spectacular October afternoon to fully tell. Now I want to be fair to Gerald Whitmore, because history deserves fairness even when it stings. Gerald was not a bad man. He was, by the standards of his time and place, a successful man, and in Calhoun County, Kansas in 1974, successful men were treated like they'd found the secret that the rest of the world was still looking for. He was 44 years old that fall. Broad-shouldered, always wore a clean Carhartt jacket and a seed corn cap that somehow never looked dirty. He drove a 1973 Ford F-250 Cherry Red, barely a scratch on it, and he'd just leased his third John Deere 4020, the flagship row crop tractor of its era, a machine that cost roughly $8,400 apiece, which in 1974 dollars was the price of a comfortable house in Millerton. Gerald farmed 1,100 acres. He'd bought his neighbor's place in 1970, bought another parcel in 1972, and he had a line of credit at First National Bank of Millerton that the loan officer, a nervous man named Darby Hutchins, had described to a colleague as ambitious. He planted fence row to fence row, exactly like Earl Butts told him to. He plowed in the fall and plowed again in the spring. He sprayed, he fertilized, he produced. And his yields, at least on paper, at least in the good years, were impressive. The thing about Gerald Whitmore was that he wore his success the way some men wear cologne. You could smell it before he walked into Hazel's diner. He had opinions about everything and delivered them without the customary Kansas pause for humility. He'd upgraded to a Gleaner L combine in 1972, one of the first in the county, and he made sure everyone at the grain elevator knew it. His opinion of Earl Dunbar. He'd expressed it precisely once, 2 years earlier, at a county extension meeting where a young agronomist from K-State had shown up to talk about something called minimum tillage. Gerald had listened for about 8 minutes before he leaned back in his folding metal chair, looked at Earl across the room, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I heard Earl Dunbar's letting his fields go fallow. Might as well let him go to weeds while he's at it." A few men laughed. Earl said nothing. He just wrote something in the small green notebook he always carried. The summer of 1974 had been difficult in ways that the commodity prices disguised. June had been wet in Calhoun County, 4.3 inches in a single 10-day stretch, which was almost unheard of for that part of Kansas. The rain was good for the crops in the short term, but for a field that had been fall plowed and spring plowed and left without cover crop or residue, which described roughly 70% of the conventional farmland in western Kansas, those June rains had a different meaning. They meant runoff. They meant crusting. They meant that the topsoil, with nothing holding it in place, was moving. Earl's fields, by contrast, had been managed under what he called, with characteristic lack of drama, stubble mulch. He used a noble blade, a wide, flat subsurface cultivator originally developed in the 1930s specifically to combat the dust bowl. The blade ran several inches below the surface, cutting weed roots without disturbing the stubble and residue on top. The residue stayed, the soil stayed, the moisture stayed. But in June 1974, nobody was thinking about what the rain was doing to the soil structure. They were thinking about what corn was doing at the Chicago Board of Trade. The confrontation came on a Saturday morning in late July in the parking lot of the Calhoun County Co-op on Main Street, Millerton. Earl had driven in to pick up a belt for his International Harvester 403 grain drill, a machine that was 12 years old and had been repaired so many times that Earl sometimes said it was more mechanics than metal. He was talking with Roy Hessler, who farmed 180 acres to Earl's north, when Gerald Whitmore's red F-250 pulled in with a sound like authority itself arriving. Gerald climbed out, spotted Earl, and walked over with the kind of easy confidence that men wear when they've been proven right enough times to stop doubting themselves. "Earl," he said. He shook hands with Roy, looked back at Earl. "Heard you didn't plant your South 40 this spring." "I did plant it," Earl said. "Planted what?" "Didn't see any corn rows when I drove past." "Planted a cover crop, oats and hairy vetch." Gerald tilted his head the way a man does when he's deciding whether something is funny or just sad. He decided on somewhere in between. "Oats and vetch," he repeated. "Earl, corn is at $3 a bushel, soybeans are at $6.50, and you're growing vetch." Roy Hessler studied his boots. "It's fixing nitrogen," Earl said. "It's building structure." "Building structure." Gerald let out a short, flat laugh. He looked around the parking lot. There were 4 or 5 other men within earshot now, and Gerald had the instincts of a performer. He raised his voice just enough. "Boys, you hear this? While we're all out here trying to make a living, Earl Dunbar is building structure." Another laugh. "Earl, I've been farming this county for 20 years. You want to know what builds structure? Plowing it right, fertilizing it right, planting it right." "You've been farming it for 20 years, Earl said quietly. "How deep is your topsoil on the east quarter?" The question landed like a flat stone on still water. Gerald's smile didn't disappear, it just got tighter. "Deep enough." "My father measured it in 1944, Earl said. 8 inches. I measured mine last spring, still 8 inches. He picked up his belt from the co-op counter. "You have a good day, Gerald." He drove home in his 1968 Chevy C10, the windows down, the hot Kansas wind coming in off the fields. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew something, truly knew it, in your bones, but the whole world around you was moving in the opposite direction? Where the evidence was right in front of everyone, but nobody wanted to look at it because looking at it meant admitting something uncomfortable. That's where Earl Dunbar was in the summer of 1974, and the autumn that was coming would be the moment 11 years of patience either paid off or didn't. Here is what Earl Dunbar knew that almost nobody else in Calhoun County did. He knew that the moldboard plow, that beautiful, iconic, deeply American implement that had been turning earth since John Deere perfected his self-scouring steel version in 1837, was, under certain conditions, a slow catastrophe. Every time you invert the topsoil, you disrupt the fungal networks, the mycorrhizal threads that connect plant roots and facilitate nutrient exchange. You destroy the burrows and channels that earthworms and beetles have spent years constructing, channels that allow water to penetrate rather than run off. You bring weed seeds buried deep in the soil up to the germination zone, guaranteeing next year's weed pressure. And most critically, on the open Kansas prairie, you leave bare soil exposed to wind and water, the two great thieves of agricultural history. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s hadn't happened because of drought alone. Earl knew that. He'd read the USDA's own reports. The drought had been the trigger, the plow had loaded the gun. What Earl had built on his 280 acres over 11 years, through a combination of noble blade cultivation, strategic cover cropping, and a planting system he developed by reading everything he could get his hands on and then watching his own fields, was something that soil scientists in 1974 were just beginning to call by a name: conservation tillage. Some were even whispering a more radical term: no-till. The idea that you could plant directly into undisturbed soil and let the biology of the earth do the work that steel had been doing. Earl wasn't fully no-till yet, but he was close. And here is what his fields had that Gerald Whitmore's fields did not. 1, 4 inches of intact earthworm channels per square foot. He'd counted them. He kept records. 2, a layer of decomposing crop residue across his entire tillable acreage that was holding soil moisture at a rate he could measure, with a simple moisture probe he'd ordered from a university extension catalog for $12, at roughly 40% greater retention than his conventionally tilled neighbors. 3, nitrogen, fixed, free, biologically deposited nitrogen from the hairy vetch and clover he'd been alternating into his rotations since 1967. He was spending roughly $4.20 per acre less on synthetic fertilizer than the county average. 4, his topsoil, all 8 inches of it, still there. The machine at the center of Earl's system was his International Harvester 403 grain drill, the same one Gerald had seen him repairing at the co-op. In conventional use, a grain drill plants seed into tilled soil. Earl had modified his with what he called coulter blades, thin disc-like cutting wheels he'd adapted from a worn-out disc harrow and welded in front of the standard openers. The coulters sliced through the surface residue and cut a narrow slot in the undisturbed soil. The seed dropped in, the residue closed back over it. He'd invented, without knowing the engineering term for it, a primitive no-till seed drill. He'd also, and this is the detail I want you to hold on to, he'd kept records. 11 years of records, in 47 small green notebooks stacked in a wooden box on a shelf in his machine shed. He had documented his rainfall, his planting dates, his yields, his input costs, and his soil measurements. The records showed something remarkable. In dry years, and there had been 3 serious ones in the 11-year period, his yields had declined less than his neighbors. In wet years, his yields were comparable, and his input costs ran an average of $11.40 per acre below the county average. He'd never told anyone this, not even his wife Dorothy had seen all 47 notebooks. Why hadn't he told anyone? Because Earl Dunbar had grown up in Kansas and he'd learned from his father that the land will tell you the truth if you watch it long enough. You don't argue with men who have already made up their minds. You watch the land, you let the land speak. The land was about to speak very loudly. Let me pause here and ask you something. How many times have you watched someone cut corners in farming, in business, in life, and the short-term results looked so good that it made you doubt yourself, made you wonder if maybe the slow, patient way was just stubbornness dressed up as wisdom? I think about that a lot when I think about Earl Dunbar in the summer of 1974. He'd been farming differently for 11 years. 11 years of his neighbors shaking their heads. 11 years of comments at Hazel's diner. 11 years of watching Gerald Whitmore's operation expand while his own stayed steady at 280 acres. Patience is not a passive thing. Patience, real patience, is a daily act of courage. Remember that, because now we get to October. October 1974 arrived in Calhoun County on the back of the worst late summer drought the region had seen since 1956. August had given them 0.4 inches of rain, September 0.31 inches. The corn had pollinated in early July before the dry spell hit, so the kernels were there, but they were small and stressed. The soybean fields were worse. Plants that had looked fine in late July now stood brittle and brown before their time, their leaves curling inward like paper held too close to a flame. And the soil on the conventionally tilled fields was hard. The summer sun had baked the fall-plowed and spring-plowed fields into something approaching concrete. When you walked across Gerald Whitmore's east quarter in late September, you could hear your boots making almost no impression. The topsoil had crusted. The moisture that had been in the upper layers, moisture that might have saved those soybeans in August, had evaporated from exposed ground through the hottest summer in a decade. Earl's fields were different. Roy Hessler noticed it first because his property bordered Earl's on the north, and he'd walk his fence line every evening in September, the way farmers do. He told his wife one night, and she later told this to Dorothy Dunbar, who told it to her daughter, Karen, who is the source of this account. He said, "Edna, Earl's ground looks different. I can't tell you why, but it looks different." What Roy was seeing was this. The residue on Earl's fields was trapping what little moisture was falling. Dewfall at night, not enough to register on a rain gauge, but enough to dampen the surface, was being captured by the layer of decomposing oat straw and vetch material that covered Earl's soil surface. On a clear September morning, you could walk Earl's fields and feel the ground give slightly underfoot, just slightly, like shaking hands with something that still had life in it. On Gerald's fields, you might as well have been walking on a clay pot. The harvest began the first week of October. Gerald Whitmore sent his gleaner L combine into his corn on October 3rd. His hired man, a young fellow named Bud Strasser, who would later farm his own ground and tell this story at county extension meetings for decades, drove the combine while Gerald paced the field edges and watched. The yields were not what they'd hoped. The corn was making 89 bushels per acre on the best ground, 71 on the worst. Not a disaster. Corn at $3 a bushel still paid some bills, but not the 110 bushels Gerald had budgeted against at the bank. Darby Hutchins at First National was going to want a conversation. The soybeans were worse. They came in at 22 bushels per acre on the east quarter. Gerald had needed 31 to break even on that ground. By October 8th, the mood in Calhoun County had gone quiet in the way that only crop failures can silence a farming community. Hazel's diner had less volume at the morning coffee table. Men sat with their cups and did arithmetic in their heads and didn't share the results. Earl Dunbar started his harvest on October 9th, a Wednesday. He drove his old International 403 drill, parked it. Actually, it wasn't a combine. He drove his 1962 International B275 tractor, pulling a borrowed Gleaner A combine that he'd arranged to rent from a neighbor, Bill Kincaid, for $40 a day. The Gleaner A was older than Gerald's machine by 8 years. It rattled. Bud Strasser, who drove past on Gerald's truck that morning and saw it, later said it looked like something a museum might reject. Earl went into his corn on the South 81st. Dorothy brought him lunch at noon, a thermos of coffee and 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, and she found him sitting on the combine's platform looking out at what he'd cut. She'd been his wife for 31 years. She knew his face. "How is it?" she asked. He took a long drink of coffee. "Dorothy," he said, "I think it's going to be all right." By Thursday evening, word had begun to reach Millerton. Roy Hessler had walked his fence line that afternoon and seen Earl's corn pouring into the grain wagon, and Roy had a telephone, and by Thursday night at Hazel's diner, where the morning coffee crowd reconvened for supper on the nights when the harvest moon was bright enough to make the hours feel different, the conversation had shifted. "Somebody said Earl Dunbar's pulling 108 bushels out of his South 80, said a man named Calvin Pruitt, who farmed 320 acres near the county line. Silence. That's impossible, Gerald Whitmore said. He was at the counter. He had a piece of pie he wasn't eating. Roy Hessler said he watched the wagons come out. Roy Hessler's been saying things for 30 years. But there was something in Gerald's voice, just a hairline fracture in the certainty that the men around the counter recognized. They'd heard it before in other men in other autumns. It was the sound of a number not adding up the way it was supposed to. On Friday, October 11th, Gerald Whitmore drove his red F-250 to the north fence line of his property, which bordered Earl's middle fields. He sat in his truck with the engine off and watched. Earl's borrowed Gleaner A rattled across the field like something out of a different decade. But what was going into the grain wagon was real. Gerald couldn't measure it from the fence, but he could see the wagon, and he could see how full it was getting, and he could see how fast it was getting that way. He drove to the elevator. At the Millerton Grain Cooperative elevator on Route 56, run by a laconic man named Herb Fosters who had weighed grain in this county since 1951, the results were not kept secret. They couldn't be. The elevator was a public place, and in a small county, the weights on the scale tickets circulated like currency. Earl's corn, as it came off the field and across the scale at the Millerton elevator between October 9th and October 14th, averaged 106 bushels per acre. Gerald's corn had averaged 87. Earl's soybeans, harvested the week of October 14th, came in at 34 bushels per acre. Gerald's soybeans had averaged 22. The numbers went through Calhoun County like wind through October corn. Every farmer knew them by Monday of the following week. Most of them didn't know what to say. Think about what those numbers represent. On 280 acres at 1974 commodity prices, the difference between Earl's yields and the county average represented roughly $19,000 in additional revenue. In a year when $19,000 could buy a house, or pay off 3 years of debt service, or give a farm family the kind of breathing room that drought years usually took away. Here's what I want you to sit with. Earl hadn't made a single special decision that October. The October results were just the visible tip of 11 years of daily, quiet, unglamorous decisions. 11 years of saying no to the plow. 11 years of watching and recording while his neighbors shook their heads. Are you making 11-year decisions, or are you only thinking about this October? On the morning of October 16, 1974, Earl Dunbar drove to the Millerton Grain Cooperative to receive his final settlement ticket for the soybean delivery from the previous day. The scale house was a small, wood-sided building that smelled permanently of grain dust and motor oil. Herb Fosters stood behind the counter with his usual expression, which was the same expression regardless of whether the number was good or catastrophic. He slid the ticket across. Gerald Whitmore was there. He'd come to settle his own final ticket. They were the only two in the scale house, and then they weren't, because Roy Hessler came in behind Earl and Calvin Prout and Bud Strasser, who had no official reason to be there at all but had driven over anyway. Word had gotten around that Earl would be picking up his final ticket that morning. The silence in that scale house when Earl looked at his ticket and folded it and put it in the breast pocket of his denim jacket was the kind of silence that has texture to it. You could feel it on your skin. Gerald Whitmore looked at the counter. He was holding his own ticket. He didn't look at Earl. It was Bud Strasser who spoke first because he was young and hadn't yet learned that sometimes the most powerful things are left unsaid. "Earl," he said, "how'd you do it?" Earl looked at him for a moment. "Didn't plow," he said. Bud blinked. "That's it." "That's it," Earl said, "mostly." He picked up his copy of the scale ticket, nodded to Herb Fosters, turned toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back, not at Gerald specifically, not at anyone specifically, and he said, "The soil knows what it's doing. You just have to stop interrupting it." He drove home. Gerald Whitmore stood at the counter for a long moment after Earl's truck left the parking lot. Then he put his ticket in his jacket. Then he walked out to his red F-250 without saying anything to anyone. He didn't come to Hazel's diner for 11 days. Here is what happened in the years that followed, because the story of Earl Dunbar didn't end in October 1974. In some ways, October 1974 was just the beginning. The winter of 1974-75 brought 3 separate wind events to western Kansas, black blizzard conditions, the old-timers called them, recollections of the 1930s echoing in the yellow-gray sky. The conventionally tilled fields lost topsoil in amounts that Herb Foster's at the elevator said he hadn't seen in 30 years. On Gerald Whitmore's east quarter, after the third wind event in February, you could see a 2-inch depression along the windward edge where the soil had simply blown away. His neighbor to the east had a 6-inch ridge along his fence line from the same events, Gerald's soil, caught by the wire. Earl's fields, covered in residue, lost almost nothing. In the spring of 1975, 4 farmers from Calhoun County drove out to Earl's place and asked if they could walk his fields. He said yes. They spent 2 hours. Earl walked with them, answered their questions, showed them the moisture probe readings, let them dig in the soil with their hands and feel the difference, the looseness, the crumble, what soil scientists call aggregate stability, between his ground and what they were used to seeing. Roy Hessler switched to stubble mulch tillage on his north 60 acres in 1975. By 1977, he'd converted his whole operation. Calvin Pruitt bought a noble blade in the spring of 1976. He drove to Earl's place first and spent an afternoon asking questions. Earl made coffee and answered every one. In 1976, a young soil scientist from Kansas State University Extension named Dr. Patricia Lund came to Calhoun County as part of a statewide study on tillage practices and soil erosion. She'd heard about Earl Dunbar from the county extension agent. She spent 4 days at his farm, collected soil cores, tested infiltration rates, measured organic matter. Her report, filed with the Kansas State Extension Service in 1977, noted that Earl Dunbar's fields showed organic matter levels 1.8 percentage points higher than county average, a difference that, she wrote, would require an estimated 40 to 60 years to achieve through conventional means, and represents a soil asset of considerable long-term economic value. She also noted that his earthworm population density was nearly 3 times the county average per square foot. She dedicated a full section of the report to his modified 403-grain drill, the homemade Coulter system, and called it a practical example of producer innovation in advance of commercial development. The commercial no-till drill, manufactured properly and available through dealerships, wouldn't arrive in widespread form until the early 1980s. Earl had built his version in 1966 in his machine shed with salvaged parts. Dr. Lund stayed in touch with Earl. She visited twice more in the following years and cited his farm in 2 published papers. When she gave a presentation to a regional extension conference in Wichita in 1979, she mentioned Calhoun County and a farmer who figured it out before we did. Earl never attended the conference. He was home. It was spring planting season. As for Gerald Whitmore, and I told you I wanted to be fair to him, and I will be, Gerald had a hard few years after 1974. The debt he'd accumulated in the expansion years grew tighter as commodity prices softened in 1975 and 1976. He sold the parcel he'd bought in 1972 back to its original owner's son in 1977. He sold his third 40/20 in 1978. But here is what I want you to know about Gerald, because the story of Earl Dunbar is not a story about defeat. In the spring of 1979, Gerald Whitmore drove out to Earl's place with his hat in his hand, metaphorically speaking, though the posture was apparent, and asked Earl if he'd walk his fields with him. Earl did. They walked for 2 hours in the April afternoon. Earl talked about residue management. He talked about the noble blade. He talked about cover crops. He showed Gerald his green notebooks, the 47 small green notebooks from the machine shed. Gerald looked at 11 years of records in Earl's careful, even handwriting, and he was quiet for a long time. When they got back to the farm buildings, Gerald looked at Earl and said, "Why didn't you say something sooner?" Earl considered that, said it once, he finally replied, "At the co-op." Gerald nodded slowly. He bought a noble blade in May 1979. By 1982, he'd stopped moldboard plowing entirely. Dorothy Dunbar passed away in 1983, the spring after the hard winter, and Earl continued farming his 280 acres until 1989, when he leased the land to Roy Hessler's son Daniel, who farms it still under what the 2020 agricultural census would call no-till practices. Not 1 acre of Earl's original 280 has been inverted by a moldboard plow since 1963. 62 years. The topsoil that Earl's father measured at 8 inches in 1944 and that Earl measured at 8 inches in 1974 was measured by Daniel Hessler and a soil scientist from Kansas State in 2019. 9.5 inches. In a county where the average agricultural topsoil depth has decreased by an estimated 2 inches over the same period, Earl Dunbar's ground had gotten deeper. Earl Dunbar died on a Tuesday morning in February 1992 at home in Calhoun County, Kansas. He was 76 years old. The county newspaper ran a brief obituary. It noted that he had farmed for his entire life and was survived by his daughter, Karen, and 2 grandchildren. It did not mention the 47 green notebooks. It did not mention the 9.5 inches. Let me ask you one last thing before we close. When Earl Dunbar was 47 years old and parking his plow for good while every neighbor he had was plowing deeper and buying bigger, what did he see that they couldn't? I don't think it was intelligence, necessarily. I don't think it was some special gift. I think it was something simpler and harder than either of those things. I think it was the willingness to watch, to look at what was actually in front of him, the thinning topsoil, the muddy creek, the wind-carried haze, and trust what he saw over what everyone around him was saying. To ask not what's working right now, but what will still be working in 30 years. That question changes everything. It always has. There's a particular kind of loneliness in being right before the world is ready to agree with you. Earl Dunbar lived in that loneliness for 11 years. He woke up every morning, looked out at his covered fields, read his green notebooks from the night before, drank his coffee, and went back to work. Not because the world was watching, not because anyone was applauding, because the soil under his feet was telling him the truth, and he had made the daily decision over and over to listen to it. The conservation tillage movement that Earl built with salvaged parts and borrowed wisdom in a Kansas machine shed in 1963 would become, by the 1990s, one of the most significant shifts in American agricultural practice in the 20th century. The USDA's 1997 Natural Resources Inventory found that farmers who adopted conservation tillage practices were losing topsoil at dramatically reduced rates. Some studies suggested 90% less erosion than conventional tillage. By 2020, an estimated 35 to 40% of American cropland was farmed under some form of conservation or no-till system. Earl didn't start that movement. He never wrote a paper. He never gave a speech. He was one farmer on 280 acres in a county most Americans couldn't find on a map. But there is a version of history that is made not by the people who get the credit, but by the people who did the work first. By the people who paid the social cost of being different, who absorbed the laughter and the comments and the head shaking, and who got up the next morning and went back to work anyway. Earl Dunbar was one of those people. There are more of them than history records. Quiet farmers, stubborn stewards, people who understood that the land is not a resource to be used up but a living system to be tended, and that tending it right requires patience that outlasts any single season, any single year, any single opinion delivered in a co-op parking lot on a hot July morning. The old wisdom is not always old-fashioned. Sometimes it is simply ahead of its time. Sometimes the man who looks like he's falling behind is the only one moving in the right direction. And sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do in farming, in business, in the quiet corners of their own life is to stop. Stop doing what everyone else is doing. Look at the ground under your feet. Ask yourself what it's telling you, and then have the courage, the stubborn, unglamorous, unspectacular courage to listen. Earl Dunbar listened. His land is still speaking. The agricultural history of conservation tillage, including the development of the noble blade by Clarence Noble in the 1930s, and the emergence of no-till farming practices in the 1960s-1980s, is historically documented. Earl Dunbar, Gerald Whitmore, Calhoun County, and all named characters in this story are fictional, created for the purposes of dramatic storytelling. Dialogue and specific events are dramatized. All yield figures, soil measurements, equipment costs, and agricultural data are based on period-accurate historical research. The land remembers what we do to it. That part is completely real.